All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're tackling what might just be one of the most famous and, let's be honest, famously misunderstood books in all of history, the Book of Revelation. We're going to pull back the curtain and see what's really going on in there.
You know, when you hear the word revelation, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For a lot of people, it's this whirlwind of chaotic, kind of terrifying images about the end of the world, right? It's definitely earned a reputation for being the one book you just don't touch if you want to sleep well at night.
And yeah, it's pretty easy to see why. I mean, the language is so intense. We're talking about multi-headed beasts climbing out of the sea, catastrophic plagues, and these epic scenes of final judgment. It's really powerful stuff, and frankly, it can be pretty intimidating to read.
But what if that's not the whole story? What if all that intense, crazy imagery was never meant to be some kind of horror movie script? What if it was actually written as a message of profound hope, a message of good news for people who are in the middle of some really intense suffering? Now that's the idea we're going to explore. Okay, so to really understand Revelation, we have to do a little time traveling. We've got to put ourselves in the shoes of its very first readers, because the key here isn't just what was written, it's who was written for, and the incredibly dangerous world they were living in.
So, let's go back to the late 1st century. The Roman Empire is at the absolute height of its power, and the guy on the throne is Emperor Domitian. Now, his reign was a particularly brutal time for Christians because he seriously ramped up something called the imperial cult, which was the mandatory worship of the emperor as a god. And I mean mandatory. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a non-negotiable test of your loyalty to Rome.
You can imagine, this created a totally impossible situation for the early Christians. If you refused to worship the emperor, you were immediately branded a traitor. This led to intense social isolation, major economic hardship, because a lot of jobs and trade guilds required you to participate in these rituals, and of course, the very real threat of persecution, prison, or even death. To put it simply, their life was hard and they felt completely powerless.
So, knowing all that, how do you write a message of hope to a community that's under this kind of insane pressure? You can't just write an open letter saying, hey everyone, don't worry, Rome is totally gonna fall. That would be an instant death sentence for you and everyone you sent it to. So instead, you use a code. And that code is a literary style called apocalyptic.
Apocalyptic literature was actually a pretty common genre back then. It uses these wild symbolic images not to literally predict future newspaper headlines, but to pull back the curtain on the world and show a deeper, heavenly reality. The whole point is to contrast the suffering you can see and feel on earth with the true eternal power of heaven, all to give you a massive dose of perspective.
And that right there leads us to the single most important key for understanding this book. We have to read it with 1st century eyes. The symbols, the numbers, the images, they weren't meant to be some scary, unsolvable puzzle for us thousands of years later. For them, it was a shared language, drawing heavily on Old Testament imagery that the original audience would have understood instantly.
Now this is a perfect example of what I mean. Take this one verse describing a river of blood. If you read it literally, it's just this bizarre, horrifying, and frankly confusing image. But for a 1st century reader, it was pure symbolism. The numbers meant something specific. 4 is the number of the earth, and 10 is the number of completeness. So when you square them, you're painting a picture of total and complete judgment on the forces of evil. See? It's a powerful message, not a literal measurement.
So once we have the historical context, and we understand this symbolic code, the real message of Revelation just snaps into focus. And that message, at its core, is one of ultimate, undeniable victory.
I mean, think about the image of Jesus you get from the Gospels, the humble teacher, the suffering servant on the cross. Now contrast that with the image we see in Revelation. It's this dramatic, totally intentional shift. We're no longer seeing a suffering servant. We are seeing a conquering king.
The author John has this vision of Jesus, glorified, unbelievably powerful and majestic. Eyes like fire, a voice like rushing waters, a face shining like the sun at full strength. Now imagine you're part of a community feeling crushed under the boot of Rome and its so-called divine emperor. This image would be a spiritual lifeline. It was a stunning reminder of who was really on the throne. And that was the core message they needed to hear, more than anything. Yes, Domitian looks powerful. Yes, the Roman Empire seems unstoppable. But that's just the earthly kingdom. The vision of Revelation was declaring loud and clear that a higher power is truly in control, that justice will win, and that their suffering was not the end of their story.
So you see, far from being a book of curses and terror, Revelation is actually structured around these incredible promises of blessing. It's like a survival guide for the soul, repeatedly encouraging its readers to just hold on and showing them exactly what they have to look forward to.
In fact, the entire book is woven together with 7 distinct blessings. You can think of them like anchors of hope dropped right into the middle of their storm. There are promises for those who read and hold on to these words, for those who stay prepared, and even for those who die for their faith, assuring them of rest and a final reward. Every single one is a targeted piece of encouragement, a reminder that their faithfulness matters. This isn't a threat, this is good news.
Which, of course, leaves us with a final thought. This book was a powerful, life-saving message of hope for people suffering under a very specific regime almost 2,000 years ago. But the core themes, endurance in the face of overwhelming power, hope when things seem utterly hopeless, and the deep belief that justice will ultimately prevail, those are timeless. And so the question for us becomes, can this ancient message of hope, written in code for a persecuted people, still speak to our own forms of suffering today?